Os horrores dos campos de concentração nazistas são bem conhecidos hoje, graças a uma devassa nas áreas mais obscuras de atuação de Adolf Hitler e sua eficiente máquina de extermínio humano. Auschwitz e Dachau são nomes conhecidos e mantêm viva a lembrança da barbárie nazista. Por outro lado, poucos ouviram falar de Vorkuta ou Kolyma, na Rússia. O mundo conhece mal as histórias de 18 milhões de pessoas que passaram pelo chamado Gulag soviético e das 3 milhões que morreram lá. O escritor russo Alexander Solzhenitsyn surpreendeu o mundo nos anos 70 com seu relato dramático no livro O Arquipélago de Gulag, que já contava bastante, mas agora sai publicado um trabalho extenso e minucioso sobre o assunto. As 677 páginas de Gulag, uma história dos campos soviéticos, da pesquisadora americana Anne Applebaum. Ela conseguiu depoimentos novos de sobreviventes e guardas, teve acesso a arquivos da polícia secreta soviética, examinou documentos oficiais sobre os campos e nos falou do assunto nesta entrevista em Londres.
The name itself, Gulag, comes from what?
It's actually an acronym. It means Glavnaya Upravlение Lagery, which means main camp administration. And that was actually the name of the institution that ran the system. It was the bureaucracy that ran the camp system. And the name was popularized by Solzhenitsyn, who used it to describe the camp system itself.
You know, trying to get an overall appraisal of the camps always leads to the difficult questions of numbers. You actually say in the book, you write that in the end, statistics can never fully describe what happened. Still, although I know it's hard to get the figures, how many people, more or less, went through the camps and how many died there?
If you put together the number of people who went in and came out and died there, were released for various reasons, the number I came up with between 1929, when the camps first began to expand, and 1953, when Stalin died, this was the height of the camps, is 18 million. That's people who went in, some died, some didn't. The number of deaths is very difficult to arrive at, and this is because the death statistics were not well kept. Camp commanders did have a reason to conceal how many people did die, whereas they did need to know approximately how many people were in the system, and therefore I feel the 18 million number is not bad. They didn't necessarily have a reason to know how many really died. Some people were released early to hide the fact that they died. They would die a few days later after release. Then if you look at the official statistics, you get a number something between 2 and 3 million, but I think that's a large underestimate.
We're not counting here, obviously, the millions of people sent into exile or those killed by orchestrated famine, forced collectivization, or simply executed by order of Kremlin, right?
Yes, the other difficulty, of course, with those numbers is that they represent only a part of the repressive system. I mean, as you say, you would have to count unnecessary deaths during the Civil War. You would have to count the Ukrainian famines. You would have to count people who died before they got to the camps, people who were executed. And when you put those numbers together, then you get a very large number indeed.
20 million, 30 million?
Then you can be happy with something between 10 and 20 million probably. And it's a real estimate. People are still working on those numbers.
And the people who actually died in the camps, they died from what? From forced labor, mistreatment, executions?
Some died from executions. Most died from a combination of forced labor and starvation. The way the camp system worked is that you were fed according to how much labor you did. So if you fulfilled the norm, you would receive the full ration. If you didn't fulfill the norm, you would receive a half ration. And that was how people died, because if you became weak and you couldn't work as hard, you would be fed less and less and less until you finally died. And that was how most people died, particularly during the war years, which were the highest death rates.
The camps were used mostly for forced labor, to carry out big government projects like the gigantic White Sea Canal. In fact, it was a slavery system, wasn't it?
It was, in effect, a slave system. People weren't bought and sold, so I was always careful about, I was not sure whether the word slavery was correct or not. But yes, in effect, it was a massive system of slave or forced labor.
Many people throughout the world first heard about the Soviet camps from Solzhenitsyn's book, which had quite an impact. But in fact, you say that although he mentions so many horrific things, you say they were actually worse than what he described.
What he describes was everything that could have been known at the time that he wrote it. What he knew came from prisoners' stories and things that people wrote to him or told him. I mean, his book is really an amazing kind of compilation of the oral history of the camps. I mean, much of what he said is things that other people would repeat later on. What he doesn't have is the perspective of the bureaucracy and of the guards and their understanding of what was going on, and for example, their inspectors' reports of the camps. And so it's a brilliant achievement, but it isn't what can be done today.
How many camps are we talking about overall?
It depends. Many hundreds. I mean, there were the number of actual camp systems is about 450, 470. But each camp was a set of camps, and sometimes there were hundreds and hundreds. You know, there would be one main camp, and then there would be, for example, forestry camps, the main camp, and then lots of little tiny camps in the forests, you know, with 200 people or 500 people. And then some of them were very large, some of them were many tens of thousands of people.
Totalitarian regimes, as we know, they tend to be paranoid. They arrest huge quantities of people as enemies of the state. But it's hard to believe that Moscow thought all these millions of people in the camps were enemies. Was there an ulterior motive for the camp?
You know, there seem to have been different motives at different times, and it certainly does seem that at certain moments the people were arrested in order to be put in the camps. You know, there would be a big engineering project. They would need a certain kind of scientist to do the engineering plans, and miraculously that kind of scientist would be arrested. So yes, there were moments when it was more about the camps were more important than the arrests, and then there were other moments when there were mass arrests, and actually people were sent to the camps and the camp commanders would be overwhelmed and they wouldn't know what to do with all these people. So it seems to have been slightly different at different moments.
The Soviet leadership pretended that the camps were economically rational and productive, but you actually say they were not.
No, it was very odd. Stalin was convinced, really, until the end of his life, that the camps were productive. And he would demand production statistics to be given to him every month. And he was a great believer in the idea that these camps were an important part of the Soviet system. He was a great fan of Peter the Great, and had read many the biographies of Peter the Great, histories of Peter the Great's Russia, and learned that Peter the Great also had used forced labor to build the city of Leningrad and to do some early industrial projects, and he thought he would do the same. But if you actually look at the numbers, it's pretty clear that they were a terrible distortion of the economy. And even towards the end, the KGB itself understood this very well, and there were reports done in the late 40s and early 50s describing how bad the economic system was. I mean, in all kinds of ways. If you think about it, it's very illogical to send your country's best nuclear physicists to dig coal in Siberia. It's not a great use of talent. It was a distortion of the labor market. So, you know, you would use lots and lots of people to do a project, such as the White Sea Canal that you mentioned, rather than using machines, which might have been tractors, which might have been more efficient. So you had people literally digging dirt with their hands rather than using bulldozers. And it was a very inefficient way of running the economy.
The worst phase you mentioned was under Stalin, obviously, who kept tight control over the camps. But in fact, thousands were people were involved in running this machinery of the camps, guards, clerks, accountants, policemen. How did they justify so much brutality against their own people?
It's very strange. I mean, the Soviet ideology was extremely powerful. So on the one hand, people were afraid. So they simply did what they were told because they were afraid that if they didn't, they would end up in the camps themselves. On the other hand, there was this constant drumbeat, you know, these people are criminals, you know, they have harmed our society, they are enemies of the people. And at some level, people seem to have believed that. You know, incredible though it seems, you know, that all these millions of people could have been enemies. And then at some level, there was such a powerful ideology of work and labor, you know, that we must all work hard to achieve the Soviet nirvana. That people said, well, these people they're serving some use, they're serving some function, they're fulfilling the work norms. And you know, the difference between living in a labor camp and living in the free society, I mean, there was a difference. But many people who were not in camps were also in effect forced laborers because they had jobs they were not allowed to leave. During the war, it was illegal to leave your job. In fact, you could be arrested for doing that. And so there were some fine differences between the systems, but some people didn't feel them to be all that powerful.
Resistance to this Soviet repressive machinery was practically suicidal, but still there were some cases of resistance.
There was resistance. There was resistance all the way through, and particularly not in the camps had different levels of harshness. In some of the easier or lighter camps, there was quite a lot of escapes. Particularly in the earlier years, it was easy. Not easy, but it could be done to escape from the camps. There were even people who escaped from the camps in the far northwest of the country and went over the border into Finland. Later on, towards the end, in the late 40s and early 50s, when the camps were full of people who were former Red Army soldiers or former partisans, or in some case even former enemy combatants, German POWs, there began to be some organized resistance. These were people who'd fought in wars and were actually able to organize a armed resistance. And there were 3 major rebellions, in fact, in the early 50s, right after Stalin's death, in which prisoners actually took over the camps and kicked out the guards. So it did happen that there were rebellions.
You write that right after Stalin died in 1953, the era of massive labor camp started to crumble. The system changed a little, but in a way it continued. It continued under Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It changed significantly. It ceased to be a mass system, and it ceased to be a very, very important part of the economy, as the Gulag was. But the system of prison camps remained similar enough. I mean, the rules of daily life in these camps were not that different from what had happened during the 1950s. But the camps became more concerned with incarcerating genuine political prisoners. That means people who had actually done something against the state, as opposed to massive, any man on the street who was arrested in the 1930s and 1940s. People would go to the camps in that era knowing why they had been sent there. You know, they would have, something very minor, they would have written a letter opposing the system, or there were very, very tiny demonstrations. 10 people would get together in Red Square and protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that would be enough to be sent to prison. But the system was the same in that it was run by the same bureaucracy and according to many of the same rules.
We talked about what was on the mind of the people in the camps, but how about Stalin himself? What actually motivated him? Ideology, power, insanity, paranoia, or maybe all of those things?
Very hard to look into Stalin's brain. And the people who've done it, I've never seen a really satisfactory biography of Stalin or a kind of intellectual biography of Stalin. He was clearly partly motivated by ideology. At some level, he did believe that this forced labor was necessary. He was also motivated by a terrible paranoid hatred of enemies, and this was where the mass arrests came in. It's clear that he, after he died, the system was very rapidly dismantled. In that, I mean, as I've said, the essentials of it were kept for a much smaller number of people, but the camps came somewhere from his imagination. Whether he liked to see massive groups of people doing his bidding, whether he liked the sense of power, is very difficult to say, but the camps were one element of the system that were very deeply connected to him, and it's very difficult to say why.
And as you indicate in the book, the camps actually only disappeared completely under Gorbachev when the system actually opened up and collapsed, the whole system overall. Does that lead to the conclusion that the camps were actually essential to the maintenance of the system?
Yes, I do think they were essential to the maintenance of the system. The system could not tolerate dissent. You couldn't oppose power. Anybody who opposed power had to be disposed of somehow. And the camps were the mechanism that the system used to get rid of opposition and make sure that nobody opposed the system.
So far, we're only looking at the camps from inside the Soviet Union. How about from outside? You write that news about the camps started to leak to the West as early as the 1920s and continued to the end, bits and pieces. How did the West react?
It's a very, very interesting story, how did the West react? Because if you look, there was, as you say, there was information about the camps all along. In my research, I was looking for older books about the system, and I actually came across a book that was written in the middle of the 1920s and published in Paris, which was an account of the very first camps of the Sovietsky Islands. And as far as I can tell, the book is completely accurate. It has names of guards, it has locations, it has numbers of prisoners approximately right. So it was possible to know about the system very early on. And indeed, in 1918 and in the 1920s, there was a lot of interest in it, particularly among the left in the West, because the Bolsheviks' first victims were often left-wing intellectuals, other kinds of socialists, the Mensheviks, and so on. And there was a great deal of outcry and opposition to the system that was growing at the time. And then you see this gradual change from the late 1920s and early 1930s, where the West slowly becomes less interested in the camps and more interested in the Soviet Union as a model, as an economic model. And this is then the era of Walter Duranty, who was the great New York Times correspondent who wrote about what a great success the five-year plan was and what an economic success Stalinism was. And then you begin to get Western travelers going to the Soviet Union looking for an example. The Webbs, many famous visitors went and came back and said, this is the new society. I've seen the future and it works. And then you begin to then there's very little information about the camps. And this kind of builds. And the real height of the sort of lack of interest, if you will, is during the war, when Stalin was our ally and the Soviet Union was our partner in the war against Hitler. And there's really no information about the camps whatsoever, even though, of course, it was still possible to know as much as was known in the 20s. Then there's, after the war, during the Cold War, there's an interest in the camps goes up, and in the atrocities goes up, and then in the 60s it goes down again. And all the time, it really has far more to do with the West and the West's own interests in socialism and the West's own ideological left-right debate than it has to do with Russia. I mean, we certainly could have known the whole time, but we knew sort of in different eras what we wanted to know.
But as you're saying, there was enough information coming out, and still the left in the West did not protest against the existence of the camps after hearing about them. Was that naivete, hard-headed ideology, or was there that frequent argument that you shouldn't play the game of the right wing and building them up? Why did the left react that way?
It was, again, different at different times, and it is important to say that a part of the left was very honest about the camps. I mean, the George Orwell's, and his equivalents in America and elsewhere, did say Stalinism is wrong. You know, they tried to remain left-wing despite this, but a very large part of the left tried to excuse or dismiss the camps, mostly on the grounds that if we talk about that will help the right. I mean, that it will. There's a famous quote by Sartre, you know, that maybe this is happening, but I don't want to talk about it because it will help the bourgeoisie. So it was an attempt. It was sort of bad for our side. It was bad for our team if we talk about this.
Since the war. We mentioned the Second World War and the importance it had, especially for the West. But since the war, Germany has made an enormous effort to exercise its Nazi past, mostly by remembering it again and again. The Russians have not done so with its Soviet past, despite being the inheritors of the Soviet policies, its embassies, and even the seat at the UN. Russia doesn't want to inherit the history. Why?
No, this is a really extraordinary phenomenon in a certain sense, because there was a moment in the late 1980s when the Russians were terribly interested in the past. When Glasnost began, when Gorbachev first came to power in the late 1980s, there were many books published on the subject. Much forbidden literature appeared for the first time. There were television programs. People discussed it at great length. And then throughout the 90s, interest grew less and less and less to the point where now it's almost taboo. It's kind of non-subject. The Russian regime, the governing powers do not discuss it. There has never been a public discussion of it. There never have been trials. There never has been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the kind you have in South Africa. There's never been the kinds of discussions you have in some Latin American countries. There's never been an open debate about what happened at all.
Why is that? Because there are too many people who were involved in it who are still there?
Again, there are layers of reasons. I mean, one is that there is a good reason, which is that Russia is going through such an economic revolution, and daily life is so genuinely difficult for people that it seems remote. You know, this is a problem of we're not interested in this. We have our own problems. But yes, it's also because the people in power, while not necessarily themselves camp commanders. You know, Vladimir Putin was not a camp commander, but he was a member of the KGB. And to discuss now the crimes committed by the Soviet secret police does make him look bad. And so they simply have no interest in propagating this conversation and no interest in this discussion, because it would reflect badly on the leadership of the country. And this is true in Russia, and it's true in other countries as well.
But as you point out in the book, if they understood that better, they could understand things happening today. You say that a conflict like Chechnya, for instance, could be better understood even by Russians if they knew more about Stalin's atrocities.
Yes, I do think, I mean, Chechnya is a very important example, because the Chechen story is in fact a very old one. The Chechens were deported in the 1940s. Stalin took against the Chechens during the war when he accused the entire nation of collaboration. And every single Chechen, man, woman, child, everybody was sent to the wilderness of Central Asia, where they were expected to die, and about half of them did. And contemporary Russians have no memory of this happening. And they find the Chechen opposition to Russian and their opposition to being part of Russia completely incomprehensible. And that means that the whole context of the Chechen War isn't understood by most Russians. And I do feel that if the Russians had the same sense of that what happened in Chechnya during the war was a terrible disaster and a horrible attempted genocide, they would find it as difficult to invade Chechnya now or conduct a war there as the Germans would in Poland. There would be this sense that this is impossible, we can't commit the same crime twice.
I'd like to ask you about a statement that you have in your epilogue here. You mentioned that this book was not written so that it will not happen again. It was written because it almost certainly will happen again.
You know, we see it around us now. What are we discovering in Iraq? You know, we're discovering that the Iraqi system was a totalitarian system. We are finding mass graves. We are finding archives that describe torture and mass arrest. The desire of human beings to typecast, to incarcerate, to dehumanize others is one that we find repeated in many societies in different ways. I mean, I don't know if exactly the same system will be created again in Russia or anywhere else, but this kind of system is clearly something that's part of human nature. It's happened in so many different kinds of societies and so many different cultures that I think we need to take it seriously as a future threat everywhere.
Anne Applebaum, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.